Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
I got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 659. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about basalt columns, outlaw hideouts, unpronounceable state parks, and incomparable national parks as we go to the state of Wyoming. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Let's talk about Wyoming. I'd like to welcome to the show Jennifer Melroy from nationalparkobsessed.com, who has come to talk to us about Wyoming. Jennifer, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here again.
Yes, I was going to say, or welcome back. Jennifer and I actually recorded this episode once before in totality, and the file disappeared. I've never had that happen before. I'm sure it was my fault, but I don't know what's going on. So I appreciate your patience in coming back and talking about Wyoming, a state that my Colorado cousins once described as a cake with all the frosting mushed up to one corner, and that being the Grand Tetons and Yellowstone. We're not going to talk as much about that corner because we have on the show before, but we're going to talk about the great big rest of the state because you think we shouldn't avoid it or ignore it.
We really shouldn't, but everybody seems to like that corner for some reason. It's not like they have a good percentage of the wildlife, geysers, and mountains.
Yes, I think the stats are that Yellowstone has more than half of the geysers in the world, so it is a pretty spectacular corner. But you're going to start us where instead? What itinerary are you going to recommend for us?
Okay, so I've got a 5-day hit the highlights of the rest of the state. We're going to start in Devil's Tower.
Okay.
Then we're going to head south and go to Fort Laramie National Historic Site. From there, you're going to go a little bit south and start working your way west, and you're going to visit a place called Vitavu. I said that wrong for everybody in Wyoming who's cringing right now. I know I can't pronounce it the way y'all do. I'm from the south.
The y'all was kind of a giveaway there.
Yeah, that usually gives it away. We're going to keep heading west, and we're going to go to Kilpecker Sand Dunes, and we're going to end in Fossil Butte National Monument.
Excellent. Okay, you started us with Devil's Tower, which I had never heard of before I watched Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but we're talking about something way out in the middle of nowhere.
So Devil's Tower, you're driving along Wyoming. It's flat with a little bit of hills, and all of a sudden there's this massive structure that stands out of the middle of nowhere. That is Devil's Tower.
A massive structure of rock, we should say.
Yeah. It is rock. It is entirely natural. Devil's Tower is the first national monument. It was created by Theodore Roosevelt.
Excellent. And that was something that I didn't know until at least the first time we did this show. So it has been a national monument for quite a long time.
Yep.
And the significance of it being the geology predominantly.
I am not a geologist. It's a unique rock formation.
It's basalt column. It is basically the leftover magma from a volcano where all of the volcano has worn away.
My favorite part about visiting Devil's Tower is actually the Native American history associated with it. It is a sacred site for 11 different tribes. They all have their own different story about how it was created, Most of them involve a bear of some sort.
Okay. Do you know any of these to share with us?
One of my favorite is the bear is chasing the girls, and then one of the gods raises the girls up into the sky to keep them away from the bear. That's one of the ones that sticks in my head.
Okay. Excellent. When we're there, what can we do besides greet the aliens that are coming there?
There is a 1.3-mile hike around the tower.
Mhm.
It's a really nice little flat hike around the tower. And if it's not the month of June, there will probably be climbers on it. And you can watch them climb up, and they'll be in these little crevices, and you'll think, how did they get up there, and why would they want to go up there? But it is a pretty cool tower for rock climbers to climb.
Excellent. And I think the only way to the top is climbing. Is that correct?
Yes, there is no trail to the top unless you are a very good rock climber.
Okay. Excellent. Anything else we want to do in the area while we're at Devil's Tower?
Not in Devil's Tower area per se. You've got two options when you're working your way down to Fort Laramie. You can drive directly to Fort Laramie, or you can head west a little bit and hit a few little small sites along the way. One of my personal favorite is called Hole in the Wall. Mm-hmm. It is a hiding place for American West outlaws and cattle rustlers. It's about a 3-mile hike on private land, and you can go visit a site where Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid hid out from the law after they robbed people in trains and things like that.
I'm not even sure that everybody knows that. Well, of course, the movie came out so long ago. A lot of people don't even probably remember the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid movie with Robert Redford and Paul Newman. But those who have seen it may not know that they are based on two real outlaws from the closing days of the West. Yeah, and this is one of those sites that is associated with them.
Yeah, the caveat with that site is if you are driving out there, it is private land. There are cattle out there. If you drive through a gate and have to open the gate, please close it, because the private landowner could close off access to this site in a heartbeat if we do not respect the fact that he has cows. He'd like to keep them in his fields.
And as I recall, this is a box canyon.
Yes, it is. So
it's a small canyon, steep walls, just like out of a Western. Strangely enough. Okay. And we're hiking there. Anything else we're doing while we're there?
No, it's really, you get to hike out and you get to see this beautiful overlook of the landscape and everything.
Okay. Excellent.
Next stop is another fun little place. Wyoming seemed to be a good place for alien movies. The next stop is called Hell's Half Acre. It's this little spiky canyon that's going to remind you kind of Bryce, just it's going to be a lot spikier, not as many individual hoodoos.
Okay. And hoodoos being rock spires, for those people who are less familiar with that. In this case, not formed volcanically, but formed via erosion, usually limestone.
And if you've ever seen the film Starship Troopers, that would be where this was filmed.
We're talking about a place that is Badlands.
Yeah.
Okay.
The next two stops are as you work your way further towards Fort Laramie. Mm-hmm. Both of these are basically called Independence Rock and Register Cliff. Both of them are Oregon Trail graffiti spots. It was where all the Oregon Trail migrants would carve their names into the rock, so you can go see stuff from during the Oregon Trail where people were graffitiing things even then.
Excellent. So these are people who were crossing over out to California and Oregon in their covered wagons, not the people who were playing the video game in the 1970s and 80s.
Then you'll get to Fort Laramie. Fort Laramie is a 19th century trading post. It was the economic hub of the region. And as we just talked about the Oregon Trail, it was a popular stop during the Oregon Trail. Mm-hmm. If you're there during the summer, and usually the weekends are more prevalent, they've got reenactors. When I visited, they had a group of Union soldiers who were cooking elk over an open fire. And they had a visiting Native American who was doing some demonstrations and whatnot. I do not remember what tribe he was from.
You say Union soldiers, but weren't battles of the Civil War out here, so these would be the cavalry from out in the old cowboy films?
Yeah.
Okay. They're wearing blue, though. I'll give you that. At Fort Laramie, let's pause there for a little bit. What can I see at Fort Laramie? How much of the fort is left? besides the reenactors who may or may not be there, how else are they interpreting that site for me?
They've got several of the original buildings. They've got, I believe, the barrack. They've got one of the trading posts. I think the general store is still there. I've been to about 6 of these forts, so sometimes what is there runs together because they're all pretty similar, but they've got signage on. You can see I know in the barracks you can see the beds. You can think about, man, these guys were short. It's one thing I always think. And I'm not that tall myself, but it's really, really short. You can wander around the site. There's usually a ranger on staff who can give you an orientation and talk you through some of what they traded, when they traded, how they hunted buffalo in that region, and the trappers and various things on that part of the history.
Okay. And this was a fort that I'm seeing was founded in the 1830s, so pre-Civil War, and then used up until the end of the wagon train, at least till then.
Yep.
Excellent. And you were taking us off someplace else.
You're going to head southwestish to a place called Vitavu. Now it's spelled like I say it. Now, Wyomings have a different pronunciation for it that I have never been able to master, so I just say it how it's spelled. I discovered Vitavu. It's part of Medicine Bow National Forest.
You're saying it's spelled like it sounds, so it's Vedauwoo.
Yep.
Vitawu is what it looks like.
They pronounce the V like a W, but I don't quite know how they do it. It confuses me. I discovered this site. I was on a road trip across the United States, and my mother said, there's some cool rock formations between Cheyenne and Laramie. That was all the directions I got, and it started with a V. I was driving down the interstate. Hey, look, there's some really cool rock formations to the right. And there's this road that's called Vitawu. And I said, okay, well, we're going to get off and we're going to drive towards these rock formations. And that's what I did. It's a great spot. It's got a lot of little hiking trails. There's a lot of rock climbing there if you're a rock climber. But I really like it because you can go and pretty much camp anywhere you want as long as you follow leave no trace principles. And then you can hike from there and go explore. You can find all sorts of cool rock formations. You can go watch the climbers climb up these amazing rock formations. A lot of that.
Okay.
And it's really quiet too, is really what I love about it, is it's a quiet spot to go camp and go hike and be by yourself.
Okay. And I'm seeing that it is more hoodoos, more of that type of rock formation, and that it comes from an Arapaho word, meaning earthborn. I don't know what the story is behind that, but I assume that they looked like these were things that had grown naturally out of the earth.
Well, there is one rock, and if you ever drive out there, you'll totally know which one I'm talking about. It looks like an old man. It has his face is perfectly like an old weathered man. That's my favorite rock formation to hang out on.
And it doesn't look like it's a particularly large area. Am I mistaken?
No, it is not. The main area is not large. If you get back in the back on the dirt roads, I do not recommend it. If you do not have a 4-wheel drive vehicle and know how to drive on very rough roads, if you get out of the main area, it gets really rough, but you can get back into the Medicine Bow National Forest a lot more. There's a lot to explore back there, but the roads are a little iffy sometimes.
Okay. And because you said we can do free camping as long as we are keeping track of things, that usually means it's Bureau of Land Management. I don't know if that's the case in that here.
It is National Forest land,
okay.
I believe.
I think you are correct.
Yeah, it's either BLM or National Forest, because National Park doesn't let you do dispersal camping 99% of places.
Right. Excellent. And where are you taking us next?
So next you're going to start driving across the state as you go west. You can stop just past Vitawu is a giant statue of Lincoln's head. Feel free to stop and look at Lincoln's head if you would like.
And you told me this before, and yet I still find it funny. Why, again, is there a giant statue of Lincoln's head sitting out here in Wyoming?
I have no idea. Somebody decided to put it up there to honor Lincoln, which I get, but Wyoming wasn't a state. Lincoln was never to Wyoming. It's a giant head of Lincoln that sits there. I think it's funny, and I stop at it every time to chuckle at it.
Okay, and it's the Abraham Lincoln Memorial Monument, I think is what it's called, or just giant head of Lincoln, yeah.
It's a giant head of Lincoln to me.
Okay. It's not just sitting there alone. It's up on a pedestal, but they didn't do the whole body because it wasn't in the budget.
Probably not.
Where to then?
So next we're going to work our way to Kilpecker Sand Dunes. These are some giant sand dunes that kind of pop out in Wyoming. You really don't expect Wyoming, the state, to have sand dunes, but it does. They're a great place to go hike. You can hike in the sand dunes and pretty much go wherever you would like on it. You're allowed to drive in certain parts of the dunes if you have an appropriate vehicle to drive in the dunes. Please don't drive in your two-wheel drive vehicle in the dunes. You will get stuck, and some Wyoming local will have a hilarious time towing you out. He will laugh at you. I promise you, they will laugh at you forever.
Now, if I just have a two-wheel drive vehicle, I'm not going to be driving my car up into the sand dunes. What am I going to be able to do without renting a four-wheel drive vehicle?
I would go hike in the dunes. There are several areas away from the driving in the sand dune areas. Get out of those areas and go hike. You can hike up the dunes. You can hike down the dunes. You can go sandboarding if you have the boards for that. It's just a fun place to go play in the sands because who expects sand in Wyoming?
I don't know. A lot of that used to be inland sea at various times, but yeah, I can't say that I was expecting sand dunes there. So you say away from the play area. So there is an area where people are taking their ATVs and their four-wheel drive vehicles. We don't want to be hiking there as much.
They're not trails per se, but they're marked areas they stay in, and you hike away from those and have a fun time exploring that area.
Okay. Excellent.
We're keep working our way west, and we're going to end at Fossil Butte, which is a area where, as the name suggests, they found lots of fossils. But it's a really good place that I like. I like going to hike there because it's got some really nice hiking trails up into not quite mountains, but large hills to go up and explore, and you can see some fossils, and it's a nice little area to explore.
And this is a national monument?
Yes.
Okay. And when you say fossils, what era fossils are we talking about? Are we talking dinosaurs or?
I think it's inland sea fossils. I'd have to double check.
It looks like you're correct. Okay, so from an older time period than the dinosaurs. We're talking about an earlier age. Excellent. One question. So that was the end of the itinerary that you pitched me.
Yep.
And we're going to talk about the other corner a little bit. But before we do, I want to get into a little more detail about this itinerary. So in general, if we're doing the itinerary, you said we're spending quite a lot of time away from the interstate and away from the big national parks and things. Are we camping, or are there other facilities along the way for people who are not campers? If I'm taking my wife along, for instance, and who has a dread of canvas, apparently, where are we going to stay?
So there's some really great places to stay. Up by Devil's Tower, there's Devil Towers Lodge, which is an eclectic mix of hotel to be at. And it's a fun little place to stay if you don't want to camp.
Okay.
This itinerary is great for people who want to camp, but if you don't want to camp, as you get towards Kilpecker and Fossil Butte, the hotels get a little bit, you may have to backtrack to the interstate to stay at one of the chain hotels at the interstate.
Okay.
As you're coming down, before you get to Fort Laramie, you have Casper, Wyoming, which has some great hotels in it. They've also got some great kind of historic older hotels that are fun to stay in because they might be smaller rooms, but they've got a lot of old timey character. They may or may not be haunted. I don't know.
When you say old timey hotels, are we talking classic hotels, motels, small town hotels?
Small town hotels.
Okay.
There are some motels to be found. The one I've not stayed at that I really, really want to stay at is outside of Vidavoo on the other side of the interstate from it, is called Vista de la Luna Bed and Breakfast. Every time I've been, they've been closed or been building. Last time I was there to Vidavoo was about 2 years ago, and they were still under construction. But the pictures of it look gorgeous, and you look across the valley and you can see the mountains and Vidavoo and all of that. I really, really, really want to stay there sometime.
Okay.
I just need to actually get up there now that they're open.
Ah, bullshit.
Bonjour, je suis Theo, a tour leader with Explore. And this is Punti. He's helping us find truffles under the trees next to this beautiful vineyard. Maybe for tomorrow's cooking class? We call it semi-heure. Parfait. Semi-o'clock. Not everyone gets to enjoy a Bordeaux sunset this way, but you will if you explore. No, Punti. Search exploreworldwide.com and don't just travel. Explore.
And then similar question for eating. Are there places that we ought to stop and remember to go along the way, or are we just better off stocking up with some groceries, doing the camping thing?
You can do either. Where there are hotels, there is
Sure.
some food options. In Cheyenne, I highly recommend eating at the Rib and Chop House. You can get sirloin steaks that are 4 inches thick, and they are perfectly cooked, and they melt in your mouth.
Okay. Once had a friend from New York who tried to tell me that the best beef in the country was in New York. I find it hard to believe that you wouldn't find it in Wyoming or Montana or one of these western states that have cows.
I describe the best beef as the one that came fresh from the cow less than a week ago.
Yep.
I mean, sorry, New York, you don't have beef cows. You can't beat Wyoming.
Okay.
As you get towards out to Kilpacker and further west, your food options get a lot more limited. You're probably going to be stuck with the chains that are by the interstate.
Okay.
So there I would consider getting and cooking yourself on your camping stove if you've got one. If not, there's some chain stuff. I know there's a Walmart. I stopped at that Walmart.
Okay.
I highly recommend anytime you see a local steakhouse, I would eat there personally.
Okay.
Particularly if they've got a full parking lot during meal times, that tells you that it is good and the locals are all there.
Well, and then you've been saying by the interstate, we ought to talk a little bit about where we're talking about. When you're by the interstate down by Laramie, you are by Highway 80, which goes coast to coast. So if you are doing a coast to coast trip and you happen to get to Wyoming on Interstate 80, the second half of your itinerary is down in this region and not that far off the interstate. Devil's Tower, as we said, is way up in that other corner.
Yeah. Devil's Tower often gets stuck onto ends of road trips that are going through the South Dakota Badlands. That's a very common, they'll do the South Dakota Badlands and then jump over to Devil's Tower.
Yeah, there you're right off of Interstate 90, which again can be used for a cross-country road trip. It's a little more windy in spots, and it is really close. And we've done an episode on South Dakota on the Badlands there. You're not too far from Mount Rushmore when you're in Devil's Tower.
No. You're a couple hours. I think it's 3 or 4.
In Wyoming distance, you're not that far.
Yeah, that is very true.
Excellent. I know you wanted to talk about that other corner with all the pretty things, which is Grand Tetons National Park and Yellowstone National Park. Again, we have done an older episode on those, but let's talk about if I'm going to add those onto my itinerary that you've got here, how many more days do I need to add on, first of all?
How many more days do you have to spend? I look at it as whatever amount of time you've got, make the most of it. I mean, I've been to Yellowstone 4 times. I have done all the major highlights of that park. I could still spend another 6 months in that park and probably never get bored. So it's one of those that it's like, take advantage. If you've got extra time, if you've got an extra week, take a week. If you've got an extra 2 days, you're going to be a fast trip through. You're only going to get to see a few things. But if that's all the time you've got, you might as well go up and make the most of it.
Well, and let's start with that. If I've just got 2 days to round this out to an even week, what would you add on from the Tetons and Yellowstone?
I would drive up through Grand Teton, assuming the park road is all the way open and you can get into the south entrance of Yellowstone. I would grow up, I would stop at Jenny Lake, I would hike one of the trails in the Jenny Lake area, and then I would spend the night there's a campground on the Rockefeller Parkway, but I would camp there overnight. And then if you've never been to Yellowstone, first thing in the morning, I would head over to the Old Faithful geyser area. I would go see Old Faithful erupt.
And because that happens roughly once an hour or so, and it's well posted and well documented, that's going to be easy for me to do.
Yeah, that is easy to do. It is one of the highlights of the park. And then I would head back around the way you just came, and I would head up to the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone.
Okay.
And I would go hike along the falls there if you only have one day. Those are the two big activities I would do. They're kind of far apart. You'll get to see some animals. I can guarantee you're going to see bison, probably going to see elk, probably going to see black bear or grizzly. I cannot guarantee anything but the bison.
Okay. And I would say if you have more time, so one of the cool things as you said about Old Faithful is not that it's the biggest or the most spectacular, but it's very dependable.
Yeah.
Hence the name. When you get there, I would take a look at the schedule that you'll find in the visitor center, and it will give you some idea of Wind Riverside Geyser or Beehive Geyser or some of these other ones that I think may be more spectacular to see when they think they might go off. And maybe you'll get lucky and they'll be relatively soon, but you may need to wait around a little bit if you want to see some of the other geysers that are in that same area of the park.
Now, we are recording this episode on May 8th, 2019.
Mhm.
If you've already been to Yellowstone a couple times, I would recommend looking at what Steamboat Geyser in the Norris Geyser Basin is doing right now.
Okay.
It has been on an active cycle for the last year and a half. So it has been erupting I believe it's at this point, it's every 6 to 14 days it's been erupting. Now, this geyser, when it erupts, it throws water 300 feet in the air. It is one of the tallest geysers in the world. So getting to see it erupt is a spectacular treat. So if you've been to Yellowstone before and have seen those other highlights and have some time and some patience, and it looks like that it might be,
yeah.
it might be erupting, I would personally go sit at it. I'm headed out to Wyoming later this summer. I'm hoping it's still going to be active because I'll go sit at it for 6 days to see it erupt, because before this, it hadn't erupted since I think like 2013 before it started erupting in 2018.
Interesting.
It went through a fairly long dormant cycle, and then before that it had erupted like twice, then had a dormant cycle. So we don't know if it's going to keep erupting or whether it's just going to randomly stop tomorrow. But if it's still erupting actively and you've been to the other highlights, I'd go sit by it personally.
Well, and the one thing we should say, you mentioned that it was a big park, and certainly the bigger of the two parks. It is the 8th largest national park that is in the U.S. and the 2nd largest in the continental U.S., all the other 6 being ones we talked about recently with Gary Arndt in Alaska National Parks episode. So that's the bad news, is that there's quite a lot of park to explore. The second piece of bad news is it gets 4 million visitors a year, which is a lot, and they're all standing by Old Faithful. So when you're in that part of the park, or on the ring road, is where you're going to see most of the visitors. It is the 5th most visited national park in the U.S., even though it is way out in Wyoming, because it is spectacular. So you mentioned the northern geyser basin. That gets a lot fewer visitors, or typically does. It may get more now with the current activity that's going on there. And some of the other lesser known places get less visitors as well.
The visitors are going to be concentrated in about 3 areas of Yellowstone National Park. They're going to be in the Old Faithful Geyser Basin.
Yep.
They're going to be in the Mammoth Geyser Basin, and they're going to be over by the Grand Canyon and the waterfall there. Those are going to be the 3 main concentrations. Now, Norris Geyser Basin, which is where Steamboat is going to probably fluctuate throughout the day. It's going to be busy, not busy, busy, kind of just as people cycle through. So that's why I said get to Old Faithful early in the morning.
Got it.
I prefer to watch it erupt at the first eruption after sunrise, because the colors are spectacular and not a lot of people get up.
That works at a lot of different tourist locations. Okay. So if I expanded and gave you 2 more days, where would you spend them?
I would spend another day hiking in Grand Teton National Park, because I like hiking there.
Favorite trail in Grand Teton National Park?
I already said it'd be one of the Jenny Lake area trails, because I like hiking around.
And that's
Jenny
a
Lake.
flat, easy trail.
Usually flat and easy, as well as I might just go hang out and see if you can see moose, because if you want to see moose, you're more likely to see moose in Grand Teton National Park than Yellowstone. Yeah, when the fire happened in
Ah,
88.
okay.
It burned out most of the moose habitat, so most of the moose moved down to Grand Teton. Now, if you're going to see a moose in Yellowstone, odds are it's going to be Lamar Valley. I can't guarantee a moose in Lamar Valley, but that is where I have always seen them.
Okay. And I think the listeners of Amateur Traveler are smart enough that I don't need to say this, but I'll say it anyway. One of the parks where there are the highest number of stupid tourist acts done on a annual basis is in Yellowstone. If you see a moose, if you see a bison, they are wild animals. Do not go try and do your Instagram photo with them. Do not put your child on them. Do, all of the things. And then there are bears. So use some common sense. I think the listeners of the show, I don't worry about. But if you want to hear some horror stories, just Google animals and Yellowstone. And there's a lot of people that are trying to weed out the gene pool.
And I will throw this in there. When you are in the Geyser Basin area,
Oh, gosh. Yeah.
there is a boardwalk there for a reason.
Oh, yeah.
Many of those basins, the water is over boiling point. You fall in, you are pretty much going to die. The nearest hospital is, I believe, an hour and a half medevac flight. The helicopter has to first fly to Yellowstone to pick you up and then fly you back.
Yeah. Don't go off. Do not. And again, I don't worry about the listeners of this show, but also you might encourage the tourists near you to stay on the path. You're relatively safe, other than the fact that you're in a super volcano, as long as you obey the rules and do what the rangers say. Certainly follow the signs, because it is a very active geological area. As we said, I think it has more than 50% of the geysers in the U.S. In the world, rather.
It's a high percentage of them. Yeah. And on top of that, I really hate having to buy a new copy of Death in Yellowstone every time people do something really dumb in there.
Oh, gosh.
You know,
There is a book that is Death in Yellowstone?
oh, there's not just a book about death in Yellowstone. There's a book about death in Yellowstone. There's a book about death in Yosemite. And there's a book about death in Grand Canyon.
That one you're going to need to get a new version based on what's happened here in the last 2 months. Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll say that because we just mentioned Grand Canyon. If there is a railing there standing by a cliff edge, do not climb over the railing, please.
Yep.
Please.
Excellent. Anything else we should know before we go to Wyoming?
I would not recommend going to Wyoming in the winter unless you are from a place like Alaska and know how to drive in snow
Okay.
and ice and four-wheel drive and all of those fun things. I like going to Wyoming sometime in late spring, May-ish, and then late August, early September. Get you nice weather. The animals are still all out, but yet you have less of the ginormous crowds you see during June and July.
And if you do have kids in school, if you can take advantage of, if your kids go back later or start earlier or something like that, looking at the edges of the summer is probably going to work best for you. Or spring break or something like that. Excellent. Anything else we should know before we go to Wyoming?
We could talk about Wyoming all day, but that probably covers it for this road trip.
Excellent. And you are nationally park obsessed. And if we were keeping score, we went to 2 national parks there that we mentioned, and a National Historic Site, Fort Laramie, as well.
So you can hit 5 National Park Service units in the state of Wyoming.
Excellent. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Wyoming.
Bison jams.
Okay, we're not talking about something you put on your bread.
No, we are talking about when the bison decide to cross the road. Don't play chicken with your car and the bison. I once met a trucker who honked his horn at a bison. I'm talking a semi-truck guy. The bison turned around and gored his semi-truck. It cost him $3,000 to repair his semi-truck because he honked at the bison.
Yeah, you have horns, so do they, but theirs are more effective. Now the tough thing. If I say you're standing in the prettiest spot in all of Wyoming, I'll give you that one first. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
I am looking at the rock formations in Vidavoo.
Even though I gave you the whole state.
I have seen the absolute best sunsets there. I have seen the most beautiful pinks I could ever believe standing there. So that's my favorite spot.
Okay. I was going to narrow you down to outside the parks, but you already did that yourself. So excellent. Our guest again has been Jennifer Melroy. And Jennifer, if we wanted to send people to your best post on Wyoming at nationalparksobsessed.com, where are we going to send them?
Probably going to be my one day in Yellowstone, which is a very ambitious, epic, how to get through, hit all the highlights of Yellowstone in one day.
So you don't necessarily recommend this.
If you really, really are desperate, you can do it. It's not one of those things. I had somebody ask me if they were going to hit all the highlights, could they do it? And I went, nah, you might be able to if you can get lucky and avoid all the bear jams, the bison jams, and things like that. So I picked out all the really important highlights to see and compiled them into a rough timeline of here's how you do it.
Excellent. So read the post and then do it in 2 days.
Yep.
Absolutely great. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us on Amateur Traveler. And people, if you're hearing this, it means it actually worked. That's the good news. And sharing with us your love for Wyoming.
Thank you.
In news of the community, I am just back from South Africa, Botswana, and Zimbabwe with a small but select group of listeners of the show. We had a great time, and we'll be hearing more about that later. But if you are interested in deciding where we go in 2020, you need to join the amateurtraveler.com/trips private Facebook group, and you need to do it quick because we're going to make some decisions. I heard this week from Sarah from sarahwithasmile.com. She's got her own travel blog, and she says, "Hi, Chris. I'm sure you get a lot of thank yous daily, and I'm happily adding another to your list. Your podcast was suggested to me on Spotify. The recommendation page suggested your podcast, and it couldn't have been more timely. A couple of weeks ago, I had 2 friends coming to visit me in Singapore from the U.S., and we couldn't decide on another destination in Southeast Asia to visit. They had a limited visit. The episode that popped up was about Ipoh, Malaysia. Immediately, I listened and was instantaneously intrigued. I sent your podcast to my friends, and they listened too and were hooked. It was then we decided Ipoh was the place to explore. Thanks for delivering fantastic content." And I'll put a link at the show notes. Sarah went to Ipoh, and she wrote about it on her own blog. Sarah, thanks so much for letting me know that where you heard about Amateur Traveler and that you're putting it to use, which always warms my heart. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have a question, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com and join the Facebook group, amateurtraveler.com/trips. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be